Okay, hello everyone. We are live. I'm with Joel. We had just a chat with Speed at his channel.
Hello.
Stop by Straighten Us Out, and we'll review a few things that were said at the channel. And I'll put here the stream, and then we will stop whenever there comes something up that is interesting to be talked about or to added or so. And probably it will not be enough time to review everything. It is a 1 hour stream, so we can eventually continue that tomorrow. So let me just put the stream here.
Yeah, I think it was actually probably closer to 2 hours, but
Joel or SFBMOD, as he is called so far.
hello.
You're going to change your name someday, right?
Maybe. Let's see.
Oh shit! I got to shut this. Hang on a second.
Postgres, SQL, things like that. I'm more of a full stack developer.
Yeah, I'm a full stack developer too. Rails is back end, and there's microcontrollers, and doing a lot of test jig for service and a computer store. We quickly got into software, and that's kind of where I stayed. Then I kind of came up through the early '80s when everything was exciting.
Yeah, I've done used to work for Texas Instruments, and I did all of the PLC speed and stuff. Sounds very muted. Oh, you turned it down.
Ask me if I did punch cards. No.
That's a little bit more.
Yeah, I showed up at 5 o'clock, and I showed up at 5 o'clock, so time isn't all. Like, okay.
Science requires observable, repeatable, empirical evidence. So the only thing for the 6,000-year-old claim to base that on is the genealogy in the Bible. The Planck talk about Einstein.
Well, okay. So you're talking about where all life came from. I'm talking about where you came from when you were a zygote. From being a zygote to what you are now, you don't believe there was supernatural intervention, do you?
Okay, Speed made the same question to me, and of course the development is already pre-programmed, so that is a non-issue.
Yeah.
The question,
The pie thingies.
That's me.
Thank you, Brian.
Sorry.
For what?
You're on mic. We're live.
Again?
Yes. Yeah, and I went to how it was more of an origins question than just how multi-cell organisms versus single-cell organisms procreate.
yeah, of course the seed has already all the programming stored in its genome in order to develop. So this is a non-issue. Of course, God is not intervening in the development of an organism. That is a moot question. The question is how life diversified, and that's different from development.
Right, or how it originated, like I was saying.
Yeah, and of course the question is as well, how did the development evolve or originate?
Right.
And that is, of course, another question, and it is something which science has no clear answer to respond to that.
Right, yeah, because we're with the zygote question he was asking. That's fairly well understood. We can watch it. We've mapped, like you said, we've mapped the pre-existing, pre-codified information within a human cell. Which is the same when you're first fertilized. You've got all the DNA code you'll ever need for the rest of your life. And so we understand that fairly well. We're still learning it, of course. But the question that we don't ask enough is how did that start?
Yes, that is the relevant question, actually. And it starts with abiogenesis, how the information got there to make the first living organism or organisms. And then if evolution explains the biodiversification entirely if the tree of life is true, if a common ancestry is true, or not.
Right. And that's what I've been fairly recently trying to learn about, is that is there true quote unquote random biodiversity mechanisms versus is what diversity we see today, was it all pre-codified? Is there actually no randomness to it all? Has everything been pre-programmed, as it also appears to be right now, the more we learn about the genomics, and we've only seen things, die. We've only seen things not de-evolve, but well, we have seen that too, but we've only seen extinctions. We've never seen actual evolution, so to say.
Yes. Well, let's keep stream.
Well, so again, you're talking about that relativity type perspective, now versus when either of us were zygotes versus what was before that. There's all kinds of relativity perspectives here, and so there's a good argument, or good, at least a debate on who you are. In fact, I follow my last boss's Neuralink project, where we're hoping to actually see where does the thought process, where does the quote unquote soul, does it actually exist in a bioelectrical, mechanical, chemical arrangement only within our brains, or is it somewhere outside of our bodies entirely? So all of those kind of questions are up in the air, and that's what we use science for, to finally understand. And so if our soul, if our being, our consciousness, whatever you want to call it, does not exist in our bodies now, much less as a zygote, where do you quote unquote come from? Where do you start?
So you're telling me that you don't believe in the science of embryology? We don't have enough evidence because of the mind?
No. In fact, there's wonderful examples of how the pre-codified, pre-engineered information function sets within DNA for all genomes, are pre-programmed, so to say, pre-codified to be able to change during the embryology, as well as even later in life, older age. There's all kinds of pre-programmed changes, and we can watch that. We can see, quote unquote, how you're knitted in the womb, as the Bible puts it. We can watch that now, not just physically on the outside, but also internally, information-wise, or programmatically wise.
That's not present in all life, though.
I believe so. What's an example you think where we don't see the formation of from the first cell of an organism?
All single-cell organisms?
Well, even those have to be copied, mitosis, whatever you want to call it, mitosis.
Yeah, but there's no developmental program in the same way as what Speed was getting at from a zygote.
Sure, but again, I apologize. That goes back to that relativity perspective. Somewhere, somehow, the first single-celled organisms were not single-celled organisms. There's still a development process. So whatever, and you're right, it's not a zygote, it's not an egg and a sperm thing, but whatever creates the first cells outside of first cells, that's still the same point of origin. Yeah. Same question.
I'm not following you. Say that again.
It seems so simple. Yeah, there's different mechanisms for, multi-celled organisms versus the single cell, obviously, but still the question, it's not so much of those kind of details, the physical details, what originated, or what preceded, what created, what started the first single cell's development cycle. There's still a process, a beginning, an origin, just as there is for multi-cells.
Yeah,
same
but that's not observable, in the present time. What we're talking about is extant species, extant organisms like bacteria,
right?
Like a mouse, like humans, like a fruit fly.
Right.
You can see a pattern.
Right. I'm sorry. I'm trying not to interrupt. Oh, right. So which is it's still as relevant as trying to find out the origin for the non-multi-cell. So again, you don't start as a zygote. Your mother creates the eggs, and then
Well, there is a series of events that has to be explained. That is the origin of life, the diversification into 3 domains of life, the transition from unicellular to multicellular lives, and so forth. All this is what actually has to be explained. And in my understanding, evolutionary biology has no compelling explanation whatsoever in regards of any of those huge development steps.
Well, exactly right. They seem to only want to focus on the middle part of it. They don't want to talk about what happens after all of those processes, or certainly before. And I just now noticed, I'm taking at the top of that video, SFBMOD stops by to straighten us out. I never had that intention, and I'm kind of offended by that. Just I noticed it.
Yeah.
Top of that's Speed's thing, I guess. Oh, well. Your father who creates the sperms. All of that has causality to something that preceded all of that. So yeah, they want to focus on just the obvious parts of it.
Wow, I have some interference here.
Say again?
Now it's gone. I had some crazy noise here. Now it's gone. Let me check again now.
Life does not start as a zygote. It starts well before that. There's something before the first zygote. And so that's the question mark. What started before? Is it some sort of feedback on my end, do you think?
Yeah, some strange noise.
Because my wife's typing. I got what started before.
What do you think? What do you think preceded the zygote, the sperm and the egg?
You're asking me or Speed?
Would be you.
Joel.
You are the guest.
Wherever all information comes from. So that's the religious question, either for or against God.
Okay, but let's. Okay, if I grant that God created your mom and dad, and they had sex, and there was a fertilized zygote. When we went from the zygote to what you are now, do you believe there's any supernatural intervention? Nestle just joined us. We're not going to gang up on you. I just thought we were supposed to have a mutable, but anyway. So what I'm asking you is, do you think there's divine intervention in chemistry from the creation, from you being a zygote to you being a full-grown human being? Was there divine intervention there? I'll grant you that God created everything prior to you. Okay.
Isn't that supernatural invention? We can suppose so. If there's divine intervention to start it, what reason would there be that there's no divine intervention, in the middle or the end or whatever else?
So you think there's divine intervention in molecular biology today?
There probably could be. We talked a little bit about that on Tangelo's channel. We were talking about the cognizant ability of certain what certainly looks like fully artificial intelligent type algorithms built within DNA, and there's cognizant abilities inside DNA. So,
yeah, I actually agree with the skepticism in regards of this claim, Joel. Mm-hmm. I have never heard about it, and I can hardly imagine that retrotransposons have some kind of ability of decision making. I don't know if you have solid evidence to back up that observation or that claim.
Yeah, later in this conversation, we did share an old 6-year-old article that I was referring to with them, because I don't have the recent stuff in an actual documented form, unfortunately, yet. And I need to work on that, I guess. But there's all kinds of old stuff even though that talks about how, that one article, for example, it described it as a civil war, quote unquote. There's a series of decisions that these transposons and other things as well, it's not just the transposons, that are somehow knowing which enzymes and which areas of the DNA to quote, it used to be called jumping genes. We used to think it was a random accident that DNA would just randomly break and then shift around and cause problems. Well, no, it turns out now it's not random. It's doing it on purpose. It's a pre-organized data archival instruction system function.
And what is the purpose of this system?
It's pulling certain archived code, pre-existing code from what used to be called inactive gene structures of the chromosomes and whatnot, and moving it to other areas to do other specific functions. It's dynamic programming. It's doing things non-randomly, and that requires decision making. That requires cognition. Well,
if you say cognition, that would imply that these heteroviruses are conscient.
Well, and I don't know that they're viruses necessarily, because again, it's part of the actual DNA. They act like ERVs, but they're not. And then the question mark is, how do they know whether they're pre-programmed or not? Even like artificial intelligence, even though some of that can mimic cognition, it certainly looks like, especially like I mentioned later in the conversation, there's chatbots, there's all kinds of things. The whole Turing complete, for we would call it terminology, is specifically about trying to get machines, artificial, unnatural things, to mimic people, cognition, so that to a point where you won't be able to tell the difference if you're talking to a machine or a person, things like that. And so there are heuristic layer decision groups within these functions within DNA. So whether they are non-thinking or if they just look like they're thinking, that's the question mark.
Yeah, I don't know anything about this kind of stuff, Joel. I have not read any relevant literature, and it would be interesting to know what you actually have to back up that kind of thing that you're saying here.
Yeah, I'm really shocked because you got hundreds of pages on that blog.
No. I have an article on transposons, but nothing in the sort that they could make decisions.
Well, like I said, so the old stuff that I am able to help people look up was, like, again, the Civil War way they described it versus, and there's another one that describes them as a basically like a secret agent, where there's different sections of these code processes built into DNA where they make literal secret messages, where they seem to borrow and rob from other RNA messaging technology and change it actually, so that the other transcription processes don't recognize it. So they make it like a secret language, almost secret RNA chains, so that these different processes can communicate each other to do all kinds of error correction and antivirus protection, all kinds of just really cool software processes, kind of under the radar, so to say, behind the scenes, like a spy, like a secret agent. Is this an example?
I don't know.
Yeah, the cut and paste, the transposon. The retrotransposon is where I think it ejects a section of temporary tRNA, and then it actually reuses that RNA to basically repaste that code back into the DNA. Normally, RNA turns into mRNA, and it gets transcribed into the ribosome and all that good stuff, and it goes make stuff. But there are some functions where it's transmitting non-mRNA messages back across the DNA chain. It's really amazing.
Yeah, let's check this video out, and then you can expose a little bit further, maybe.
Sure. What are these orange things? Do you know? Okay. Yep. I think those are the transposons. They'll cut and paste. They'll move things around. And so the question mark is that process, that little animation, does that happen just purely by random chance, some chemical function, or is it have a mind of its own? Is it a cognitive, self-aware AI thing that somehow is told what to do, or knows how to do these things?
Yeah, I mean, there is, of course, a lot of information in regards of the process, how it happens. Now, the question is, which you brought up, is if that process is based off cognitive understanding what has to be done, or if it's just a pre-programmed process, depending on I don't know what actually makes the whole process starting it.
Right. And so my understanding, the transposons themselves, they're very simple protein. Well, not simple, but they're just a protein or an enzyme, a collection of enzymes. And there's no coding necessarily. Certainly nothing like an RNA strand, much less a DNA strand, that has a long, complicated set of algorithmic instruction sets. It's that this doesn't exist in these sections, these little agents, these little tools, whatever you want to call them. And so it doesn't seem like it has its own self-programming to do these things. So that's what I'm saying. Is it just and also DNA only has 4 different types of chemicals, the 4 nucleic acids. So what keeps this transposon from going to some other wrong section of the DNA? If it's just a strictly raw chemical reaction that's seeking out specific chemical DNA peptide chain sections, there's going to be plenty of sections that are identical to another section. If you don't look at it in a certain long-term instruction set, so it could make all kinds of errors. And that was one of the original assumptions, especially in that 2014 article that I shared in their channel, that it was just a bunch of mistakes, and that there was other processes that would try to correct these mistakes. That civil war going on, as they called it. And so since then, though, I've read where it doesn't make mistakes. It's all doing it correctly.
Yeah, let's finish to watch that video, and then maybe I can ask some further questions.
Okay.
Let me actually restart it, because I think.
Hey, George Bond.
You know that guy?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that transposable element, that is a protein. Is that correct, Joel?
Probably. I think it's a protein. I think those are proteins, but they also have an enzyme function associated, trying to search out and again make decisions on other protein things that they're interacting with along the DNA.
Okay, this is interesting. I mean, we know that many proteins, they are signaling proteins. They actually have the function to signal and direct other molecules in the cell, like, for example, in tissue formation, in morphogenes. Okay, so what science doesn't know is the language of these signaling, as we discussed yesterday. So. Of course, the question is, this signaling, isn't that simply a pre-programmed informational language which is stored epigenetically somehow, and which is used by these transposon elements to actually making the cut and paste depending on the input of information somehow. Right. Now, of course, having a pre-programmed function is something, but actually having cognitive ability, that would be an entirely different dimension, I would guess.
Well, not necessarily, because again, even in human AI technology, we do work on.
Joel, it is again distorting your voice. I don't know if it has something to do with that booster which I installed at my computer here. Let me check now. Hello.
Test.
Yeah, now it's normal again. Yeah, can you continue, please?
Sure. Yeah, I was going to say we do, at least we have attempts at least of creating our own AIs to be cognitively aware. And again, it's all cognition, really, even human cognition. It's discussed as, at least as it boils down into what's called heuristic layer sets. And the more layers you have, the more sophisticated, the more complex or more intelligent, so to say, quote unquote, something can be. So humans, and they calculate how many different heuristic layers that an average human at a certain age or whatever development stage has. And so we mimic those kind of things in AI, and there's all kinds of concerns, whether or not our artificial AI, artificial intelligence, can become super intelligent, as they call it, the super AI, and then basically take over the world, the Skynet thing. And there's all kinds of conversations with that. So you can program cognition. You can, or at least what I would describe it as mimicking it. And so that's
cognition is completely stochastic. I mean, there is no, how can I say, that is something which is completely independent from a pre-programming or so. That is the hard problem in science, which is conscience, which is intelligence, which is mind, which is
Intuition, right?
intuition, exactly. So I could not imagine that they will ever be able to break that barrier and be able to program a device to become conscient and make decisions as we do.
Right, but that's the effort, though. So, and we're actually pretty close. We've got the ideas, the science is available, and so that's kind of one of the, especially for the I don't know what you call them exactly, the super AI, the people that want AI to take over the world. And there are people out there that are like that, and so that's what they want to be able to do, and whether or not they it has muddled the waters, so to say. It's blurring the lines of what we would like to assume is some sort of spiritual aspect for cognition versus to be able to just, way I describe it is mimicking it. You can measure, you can create these heuristic sets, these decision layers, and you can make it seem like it'll make it. There's a point where we will not be able to tell the difference if we're talking to a human versus a non-human, essentially. So what do we see in DNA? Do we see a spiritual element where God or something, I don't know if God sends angels. I mean, there's all kinds of speculation of how he helps these things regulate within DNA versus are they mimicking other decision layer sets?
Well, this is precisely the point where I think that speed and the ones that were chatting with you were skeptic. And to be honest with you, I am a skeptic as well in regards of that proposal and hypothesis.
Well, yeah, and that's fine. That's the whole joy of science. But the question, oh,
it is distorting again. Wow. Okay.
Annoying. How about now?
Yeah, now it's okay. Do you listen that noise too?
No, I don't hear anything.
Strange. Let me check this.
I can probably switch devices too.
Maybe it is that booster that I installed today.
Is it easy to uninstall real quick or no?
I hope so.
Like I said, I can switch devices. It'll take me a couple minutes, but while it's working, so the question basically is what's going on? I mean, the only assertion I'm making is that there are decisions being made. The question is, how are these decisions being made?
Yeah, but for example, in the gene regulatory network, that works based on Boolean logic, that are also decisions, but these decisions, they are pre-programmed depending on the input of information, for example, from the environment.
Well, I'm not sure. All I'm talking about is how these different functions interact with the DNA.
Yeah, but we have that kind of Boolean logic, which is logic decision making, depending on different sets of information in the gene regulatory network, and but this is known to be pre-programmed.
Okay.
Let me check. Yeah, I have it here. I
Right.
can
So
put
that's
it.
where
You can.
That's where it seems to be an artificial intelligence, a pre-programmed intelligence. Right.
Yes, but it has nothing to do with free decisions.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So, however sophisticated this AI, must be, that's the next level question. Is it just simple AI that's just following a pre-programmed path? That could be the case. It seems like it's more sophisticated than that to me, because again, it can jump around, move across chromosomes. It can do all kinds of wild things that doesn't seem easily pre-programmable, certainly, but it's a question mark. How sophisticated is this AI in DNA?
Mm-hmm.
Is it just super AI, basically, for lack of a better term, versus is there some sort of, which again, AI, we call it cognizant, even though I think maybe what we're talking about is, again, more of a spiritual, something that's outside of matter. If that makes sense. I don't know, man. That might help. I don't know.
Yeah. Let me show you this picture here.
Well, even even if an AI, a cognizant AI, it's still technically outside of matter because it's an information. It's the only matter involved is the programming, and then but the information is immaterial. Yeah, that's
You
based.
see, yeah, this is based on Boolean logic,
Mhm.
and it's basically based on the input of and combinatorial input. And if you have here you can see it here. I'm
Very familiar with that. That was my first job out of high school was military electronics. So yeah.
yeah. So we know that the gene regulatory network works based on Boolean logic, and these combinatorial sequences where different inputs they are processed like in a computer, and then the outcome is a specific gene expression in order to respond to that input from the environment, and that is then basically what organisms do. They adapt to the environment based on that kind of information input. But this is not something that is based on conscience or decision making. This is something which is pre-programmed and then operates based on what has been pre-programmed. So there is absolutely nothing sort of conscient in that process.
Okay, so my skepticism wants to ask, okay, are we making distinctions between basically hardware versus software? This is hardware. So for like a human-made cognizant AI, that's mostly software based on a hardware substrate of microelectronics like that, tri-state gates and stuff like that, the microprocessors. So there's the physical aspect of it versus the material aspect of it versus the immaterial information, the heuristic layers, that make that they're basically allowing to make these decisions, these cognizant decisions. So when I look at the transposon, it's just a small piece of protein. It's just a collection of chemicals. Is for lack of a better word, the transistors, the AND gates and stuff like that, the binary logic you're talking about, is that in that protein group that's floating around and it's just connecting the dots correctly on the DNA, moving the code around, or is there, is that it seems like there's more to it than just that to me.
I would be very careful with making this claim, Joel, especially if you do not have scientific evidence to back it up, because otherwise you will be basically ridiculed by that claim.
Yeah.
I think I would say that it is probably much more rational to say that these transposal elements probably they have some sort of signaling capacity. They have maybe the ability to get information input and then process it, and based on that information processing, they will know where to cut and paste the DNA.
So that is actually confirming my whole thing. So the idea again is that if there's a cognizant AI that has heuristic layers that are capable of receiving information to make a decision, then that's exactly my theory.
But that is what we see in the gene regulatory network as well, where you have the input of a signal from the outside world, and there are sensors on the membrane of the cell which can detect the information, process it, send it to the gene regulatory network, and there the logic gates, the information is joined together, and based on the input of different signals, then an outcome is decided. But this is all pre-programmed. It's not something that is cognitive.
So yeah, I think the distinctions are that you can pre-program cognition. Call it cognizant AI.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but what would be the ultimate source is always a pre-programmed program.
Right, and then there's all kinds of other conversations that could be had, whether or not humans have some sort of layer of pre-programming, so to say. Certainly with instincts, and we can be trained. For example, we can be whatever other word you want to try to come up with to how you can kind of manipulate how people think.
Yeah, but that would be more something into psychology, I guess.
Yes, it would be. Which again, that's cognition. The same thing with AI, which
Well,
seems to be happening in these processes. I see these things. I see these chains moving around. I see patterns that could go millions of ways. It seems because again, the DNA itself is not. I mean, the DNA is super complicated, but the chemical structure is not. So seeing these simple chemicals, simple chains, doing extraordinarily complicated things, there's some very complicated decisions going on.
yeah, that is the same with the signaling pathways. There are only a few of them, half a dozen signaling pathways, but they are responsible for the entire information processing and uh, 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 uh,
Translocations and transcriptions, right?
yeah. These few signaling pathways, they determine everything that has to do with communication in the whole body. So that's the same situation. There are not many different signaling pathways known, but they do extraordinary processing also in the brain.
Right, or just even within each individual cell. It reminded me how the cell itself is a whole nanotechnology factory, and there's all kinds of signaling going on, like you're describing. So it's just I don't know. It seems extraordinarily complex. And then inside the nucleus, there's a whole nother signal network going on that's helping to. So that's the question mark: is our prearranged signal? That's what it sounds like. What your conclusion is, or your hypothesis is that there's prearranged signaling going on, telling these transposons and other things where to make these corrections and where to unarchive the data, move it around, and then versus is it the other question is it not just prearranged signals? Is the components themselves either have some sort of pre-programmed cognition, or is there some sort of other external force, whatever you want to call it, that's controlling it all? It's hard to tell.
As I said, I would be very careful to make such a claim unless you have observational evidence
Sure.
to back up this claim.
Yeah. Well, we know for a fact that the stuff that I need to find out or find again that I've read in the recent past is that the little secret agents, they call them, whatever, and the other ones, they're not random. They are doing things on purpose. The question mark only is how is it doing these things on purpose? Is all.
Well, I have recently investigated the mechanisms of self-fate determination and differentiation.
Mm-hmm.
And no, that is what actually I was not wanting to look at now. Just a moment.
Sure.
It was of that one.
Yeah, and to clarify, I'm not claiming I know how these things do it yet. That's part of what I think other people are trying to understand.
Oh, I have again distortion here. Let me see if that goes back.
If you don't mind, I'm gonna log out here and change devices to see if it helps.
Okay.
I'll give you about 2 to 5 minutes.
Okay.
All right. I'll agree. Hopefully it'll be back. If it takes longer than 5 minutes, I'll come back to the computer. I'll be right back.
Okay, no problem. Hi, P. Mars.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
How are you?
Fine, thanks, and you?
I'm well. I I guess I was wondering if I could get your opinion. Um, so my interpretation of the Bible, the Christian God is a God of freedom and not a God that enslaves people, right?
Okay.
But I'm watching the Atheist Experience, and Matt Dillahunty like cherry picks verses from the Bible and makes it seem like the Christian God thinks it's good to enslave people, which I feel like is the antithesis of the Christian God.
Yes, yes. I have an article on that. I can link to it, and then you can have a look. It takes a little bit
Okay.
time to read through. Just a moment, please.
Could I ask, would you agree that the God does not support slavery?
Yes.
Okay.
The problem is that slavery has existed through all human history.
Yes,
And
it's a problem with civilization. I feel like there's never been a civilization without slavery. They go hand in hand together. So you can't blame that on Christianity or the Christian God.
yeah,
It's a human.
I'm putting the link here on the chat so everyone can access it.
I was thinking about. Okay, I'll check that out.
I have two links on that issue. I will put both of them in the chat so you can save them, and then after our chat you can read about the issue. But you see, when they went to Jesus and they asked him about devotion, then Jesus said that devotion was never something that God approved, but upon the hardened hearts of the Jews back then um, God somehow made some concessions in regards of the divorce in the Old Testament. But that wasn't because God was conceding it. It was because it was difficult to lead with them in regards of that issue. And I think that
Right.
the same occurs in regards of slavery. I think if God is a God of love, then He wants that we are freed and not enslaved by other humans.
Exactly, because love is freedom.
Yes, exactly.
And that's why He gives us the choice to not believe in Him or reject Him. That's the choice we have. So that's proof that God is love and He is freedom, and He wants us to be free. But it's man. I feel like man has created a hierarchy, and it's man who's created slavery.
I mean, if you see the history, how modern slavery, especially in the United States, was abolished, it was principally by Christians. It wasn't.
Yeah.
It was not by atheists, especially. You know.
No, so it did not work on the tablet.
Yeah. So,
We know if it's screwed up.
Mars, I am not very versed in regards of slavery, but I am happy to have an episode just on that topic. But I would need that someone that has more studied the issue would join and then give the relevant questions. But I think what I have studied is in the chat here, these two links. I think they give already quite good explanations in regards of that topic.
Okay, I'll check that out. I was thinking about calling the Atheist Experience, and the points I was going to bring up, well, obviously he won't listen to anyone. He'll just be rude to me. But I would bring up like the fact, like one of the, is it in Genesis? I can't remember. It says God made man in His image.
Yes, that's
So
in Genesis.
I feel like that statement is a statement to the equality of man. Like we're not necessarily equal. Like you might be better at something, or you're taller and I'm shorter, whatever. We're not equal, but we're, in terms of human value, we're all of equal value because we're all made in God's image. So that to me flies in the face of slavery, that right there.
Well, I think there are some lines of reasoning that the meaning of slavery in the Old Testament was different than what it means today, in the sense that it would rather than be translated as slave as a servant, and that
Yes.
there were people which they had debts with other people, and then they paid their debts as servants.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
would agree with that as well.
Well,
And another thing I thought I'd bring up to Matt was there's 1 Samuel 8, right? And in 1 Samuel 8, the people of Israel ask Samuel for a king so they could be like the other nations. And that displeased Samuel, and like God didn't want Israel to have a king. And God basically warned people, like, if you have a king, he's going to be a tyrant, and he's going to pretty much enslave you. I'm paraphrasing here. And but like, and you'll come, and what does he say? He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you. So God warned us. So the people asked for a king, and God was like, no, you guys, that's bad. You should serve me. If you serve a king, he'll enslave you. But the people ignored God, and he's like, okay, well, this is what you wanted, so this is what you get, and if you complain, I'm not going to help. So God warned us about this. So it's humans chose against God's will to have a king, which would lead to slavery. So God tried to save us from this. So it's the total opposite of this perspective that Dillahunty is like, oh, Christian God supports slavery. It's a complete opposite. I don't know. That's what I
agree.
was thinking.
I agree with you. I mean, the problem is that these people, they make up a straw man God, which does not exist, based on selected versicles in the Old Testament, and then shut down or shut up that straw man God, which in reality does not exist.
Right, and like you made the point about how Jesus said you shouldn't be able to divorce, but there was like parts in the Old Testament that said it was okay, because and like Deuteronomy it means rules. So they were in part of the Old Testament, they were just putting down the laws, but those were human laws. Those weren't God's laws. So even though it's in the Old Testament, it's not necessarily God's law. I would argue. Wouldn't you say?
As said, I am not very familiar. I don't want to give an opinion or information which then will not be accurate. So I prefer not to answer your question unless I would investigate the issue and then give you an answer based on sound theology. So
gotcha.
But I think we have many examples where God was really. You see it like example with Lot when he left Sodom and Gomorrah, and he was literally bargaining with God. And so you see that God is actually not simply someone that imposes his will to us, but he actually even negotiates somehow with us, and that demonstrates that God is not a tyrant. He is not a monster. He is not someone that has pleasure in misfortune of people. Quite the contrary. I mean, he wants always our best. And if he would be that monster, which is sadistic and has pleasure in seeing people suffering, then he would never have sent his son to die on the cross for us. So that is completely contradictory, actually. I mean, we have a perfect image of the Lord's nature through Jesus Christ, which is compassionate, which is love, which is graceful, and which demonstrates a superhuman strength of will through what he did to go on the cross freely for us. And this based on his love for us. So he really wants only our best.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with they create a straw man god, and yeah, it's not because I wouldn't want to follow a god that supported slavery and all these things they say. So I don't know. Yeah, it's just a lame. I guess what Dillahunty's doing is he's just putting on a performance and it's just entertainment. And he's just attracting people that basically hate God or something. I don't know, but it's just definitely not a legitimate show where they have honest dialogue with people. So it's like a Jerry Springer, really. So
Can you guys hear me?
yep.
Yeah, I thought Exodus 21:16 solved that whole argument, debate.
What does it say there?
For the slavery debate? Well, like you were saying on Tangelo, there is a distinction between basically involuntary slavery versus voluntary slavery. So
Yeah, which I said.
Right.
Which I said about a servant.
Right, and so even in the modern day, just going to a job, that's a version of voluntary slavery. But no, Exodus 21:16 specifically says kidnappers must be put to death, whether they are caught in possession of their victims or have already sold them as slaves. So that is if that's any kind of precinct or law, that's saying that if you cause involuntary slavery, which is what kidnapping is, and I think some other version translations actually do say something more specific than that, then that means it's punishable by death. So involuntary slavery in the Bible is a capital crime punishable by death. Everything else is talking about voluntary slavery, like Antangelo was talking about.
I don't know. I see it just being brought up all the time. The atheists bring up, the Bible supports slavery, and then they cherry pick. Like they always give Christians crap for cherry picking stuff. Maybe more so when it comes to evolution or science. But they completely cherry pick the Bible to say things like, it supports slavery and stuff like that.
Yeah, and even outside of the Bible, we have basic human history. So the global we call it abolitionist movement, the idea to end racial segregation, much less slavery, that was started unequivocally by a gentleman named Wilberforce, who was actually working with Darwin's grandfather back in the mid to late 1800s. He was a British prime minister, or not prime minister, but he was a British parliamentary guy. And if it wasn't for him, we'd still have slavery today in the modern time. Essentially, so they completely ignore that fact. And he used the Bible to end slavery, and of course, so did the United States and everybody else.
Well, the problem is as well that there has never been an age with more slavery than today. And if you go to Muslim countries and Pakistan and India and so forth, their modern slavery is very common, and the human population which is enslaved today is much larger than at any time in the past in history of humankind.
Not just volume, but even in atrocities. So if we want to make some sort of comparison, so to say, atheists versus theists or Christians, China, it's an atheist nation state. It's dominant atheist. I share articles, unfortunately, too often, where there was a British International Tribunal just a few years ago that finally made their final. They submitted their findings that they have confirmed that the atheists in China are actively and literally gutting what I call their slaves, the political and religious dissident slaves. They're gutting them alive. They're harvesting their organs while they're still conscious, and then selling them on their very lucrative organ transplant market over there. It's they got one of the best organ transplant healthcare systems in the world right now. People fly all over the world for these organs. They're gutting their slaves today.
Yeah, these atheists who criticize Christians or the Bible for supporting slavery, it's really hypocritical because a lot of them probably are using iPhones, and iPhones, the batteries in iPhones are from a company that uses child slavery. Has been in trouble for child slavery. So
the cobalt mine.
They're like, oh, slavery's bad, and they're buying from corporations that have child slaves build their products they use. So
You familiar with Foxconn?
No.
That's the main manufacturing corporation that Apple has been using for years and years, for decades now. And their main. Are you familiar with them, Montegalo?
Yeah. It's a huge company. And they had several problems of human rights because they were totally exhausted, the workers there, without holidays and so forth. But I would like to mention something else. There was a debate with Ray Comfort, with Matt Dillahunty, and then you know that Ray always asks, "Have you lied in your life?" And then he asked Matt, "Are you watching porn?" And I said, "Oh, I watched this morning. So what about prostitution?" And then he said, "Well, what's the problem with that?" But we know that there is a huge slave problem in the United States with women which are forced to prostitute themselves. And of course, prostitution is a big problem because of women which are like enslaved. They are brought from abroad, from other countries, and they have huge debts which they have to pay to their pimps. And that is modern slavery straight in the United States. And if you say that prostitution is not the problem, hey, what about that? How about all these young women which are basically forced into the sex trade?
Right.
So this is hypocritical, if you ask me.
Yeah, and to go back to that Foxconn thing, it's far worse than just human rights stuff. They're famous now, especially their giant manufacturing complexes in China. They've got what they call suicide safety nets, where their employees are so miserable and they're so just more than just overworked. They're literally going on top of their buildings and just throwing themselves off to just kill themselves.
Yes, they had serious problems with suicide. But worse than that, this of course they are there because they have no other options. And if someone leaves the company, then there are 10 that want the same job, even if it's so miserable. But I saw a series of reports in Der Spiegel in German, and they did investigate this for years, and they made a very, very in-depth report of what goes on in China. Like if there is a local businessman which is opposing publicly a local a politician which is a part of the Communist Party, and if he posts just one sentence in Facebook in the social networks on the internet, and the Communist Party sees that, they go to the home of this guy, they shut down the whole company, and they bring him to concentration camps where he is enslaved for years to do forced work. And if he doesn't do it, the punishment is very harsh. They have to be in solitary confinement and stay on without stools, without beds, with anything. It's just torture. And they are there producing, sometimes they have a wage, they have to make 1,000 or 2,000 pieces or for whatever quantity per day of the same product, monotonous work, just to supply these companies in Xinjiang, which make all the industry production of China, which makes cell phones and all that stuff. So if you buy a doll or a cell phone or whatever, then we can be sure that any of the parts that are inside of the products, they are made by slavery work.
Yep, and it's not just China though. And take a look, that's the norm for atheistic societies, all the way from Nazi Germany did that, the Soviet socialist fascists did that with their gulags. North Korea's doing it. I mean, that's the norm for that ideology.
Yes, I mean, it's obvious. As soon as you do not consider that there is a God which will judge our decisions, then basically whatever is good goes. And even if it's there is no moral standard, what is okay, what is not. So if you want to enslave the whole population, what hinders you to do so? And I think that Jeffrey Dahmer, he brought it very nice to the point. He said, if there is no God, and if we are just a product of evolution and came from a pond, then what hinders me to extrapolate the normal range of behavior and do just what pleases me?
Yep, I got his direct quote somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
This is that is the obvious consequence of atheism, because you cannot have ought to be's. There is just an opinion. I have the opinion that X is okay, and you have the opinion that Z is okay. So what is the difference? The difference is that you have just a different opinion. So what is the problem if the pub was go and slaughter their neighbors and eat them if they think that's okay?
Yeah, and not to claim that all atheists, are Jeffrey Dahmers, but I think that's the actual mental motivation for things like the theory of evolution. Darwin certainly was a white supremacist, unequivocally, but that the whole premise, the whole worldview is dedicated to the idea that to basically dehumanize humanity, that you are nothing more than an animal. And as you alluded to, Antangelo, animals do that. Animals will eat their own young, monkeys, apes as well. They'll eat other monkeys' young. There's the very territorial, dominance structures in these other animal, kingdoms, so to say. And I think that there's a lot of humans that want to simply mimic that and justify it. And that's why they need almost religiously to believe that they're just animals.
Well, if you consider that Darwin lived in the Victorian era in England, and that was a very, very conservative society, and having matrices and extra-conjugal relations, that was, of course, absolutely negative seen in society, and that because of the moral standards back then.
Yeah.
And of course, when Darwin came with his idea, that freed the in special the rich elite to have their mattresses and see no moral problem with that, because after all we were just a product of evolutionary mechanisms and there is no God which enforces a moral behavior.
Sigmund Freud was instrumental into that too. He was promoting the idea that humans are just animals.
Yep.
So the thing is with tyrants don't like religion because of the morals. It limits they want to be able to do whatever they want.
They want to be God, right?
Right. So that's why there's been an attack on morality for a long time. Because
Yeah, the definitive reference for that was this he was I call him an ex-Soviet socialist fascist slave. He was a pure mathematician scientist back when the Soviet Union was still going on. And he wrote this guy named Igor Savarvich, how I can't pronounce it. But he wrote a book called The Socialist Phenomenon. And it was basically a premise where, because
Igor Shafarovich.
Thank you, Milo. He again, he's a scientist, and he's hearing all this wonderful message from the government, from the Soviet socialist atheists about brotherly love and unity and equality, all these wonderful brotherhood stuff. But at the same time, he's noticing all these mass murders, all these purges. It's the exact opposite going on. And he actually went and tried to find other humanity scientists, anthropologists and whatnot, to help try to understand why is this going on? What's the human condition that causes to say one thing and do the exact opposite? And when he writes about how when he went to go do that, he couldn't find any humanity professors or scientists anymore that disagreed with the state, because if they did, they'd be murdered. So he was really frustrated. So, and he wasn't his science was in mathematics, but so he took his pure mathematics, just like John Lennox, if you guys are familiar with him, he took that perspective and then went and did his own research on trying to find out and understand. And he made this exhaustive analytical analysis of history going all the way back to pre-Egyptian times and everywhere in between. And this is a huge volume. It's difficult to read. That there is a free translation on it now on the web, but if you want to really, that's the definitive, exhaustive reference to all of this.
Interesting. Yeah. The bottom line is that atheists, they think they can come up with humanism and with their own moral system. But the simple fact is that when there is no God and which establishes ought to be's, then there can be no objective moral standard. And what Dahmer said, when you have no God which is above you and judges you, and you are tempted to make a robbery or to cheat your wife or steal or whatever or murder something, hey, what hinders you? there is nothing to hinder you. I mean, okay, you have the
No
innate
reason to,
knowledge that it is wrong, but it is much easier to mute that and then just go on and do what you want to do.
right?
And that is ultimately what Aleister Crowley said: do whatever you want. That is a very satanic principle.
Yeah. I'm 18. I do what I want. Hey, I'm gonna take off, but thanks for letting me pick your brain. I don't know how to pronounce your name.
Untangelo.
And I'll check Untangelo, and then I'll check those links out. And nice to meet you, SFB. So
Okay.
Yeah, you
have a
too,
nice
man.
night, guys.
Great. Welcome. Bye bye.
I love Einstein's take on all this on Tangelo. Love everything about Einstein.
Yeah. He was obviously had many opinions on many different fields, and
Yes. love his
he's a
work.
very, very charismatic person, and he's fascinating, really.
Yep. He was a humanist. He was a true humanist.
Yeah.
A lot of humanists like to claim they're humanists. They're not.
Yeah.
Oh, so my mic sounding better or no?
Excuse me?
Is my mic working better, or your mic, or my mic, whatever the sound problem was? Hey, John.
No, you have no problem now. I think I hear you well. Hi, John.
Hey, what's up, guys? How y'all doing?
Fine, thanks, and you?
Oh, hanging in there. A quick question / thought, SF Joel, about your stuff earlier with speed and all them. So, and you guys were talking about the whole compression issue.
Yeah.
Were they not like well, let me make sure I'm not out to lunch here. So, like on SSD, the data is being stored in transistors, right?
Yes.
Okay, so there's a physical, like the data itself might not have mass, right? But it's being stored in something that does, right?
Right.
So the question I would have is, if you only had transistors that could fit in the equivalent physical space of DNA, like chromosome, how much data could actually be stored on those transistors?
That's actually very, very brilliant. Matter of fact, we're getting down to the point where silicon is too fat to put transistors on. We're going to have to figure another substrate out. So you're absolutely that's a perfect example of why we need to try to understand how DNA, how its lossless compression codec works, so we can do that with something other than silicon.
Right. So I wasn't being able to like figure out like where their disconnect was happening when they kept trying to say that it didn't like lossly versus lossless like didn't apply. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You have to have a physical medium to store. That's the whole point of like the compression that we're talking about in this context. And then it's like they were only being able to contemplate the premise of it like being, magnetically stored or whatever. And versus that you still have to have the medium to compress.
Exactly.
And that I just wanted to make sure I wasn't like I wasn't losing it. And then because aren't they even getting into like the SSD stuff? Aren't they even getting into like quantum tunneling and stuff with the electrons and I'm like, I'm like, dude, that's like nuts, man. What do you think about it?
The animator layer back in 2000 was using the quantum tunneling was a barrier. There's all kinds of it was settled science. There's no way to get past the quantum tunnel problem, but nope, we figured out how to use it.
Is that the Fowler Nordheim or whatever it is, something like that?
I have no idea. All I know it's MOSFETs.
But yeah, that to me, when you think about that, you were making the point of like it's 6 feet long, and yet it gets compacted
into 2/10,000ths of an inch. Like it's like what? That's compression.
Yeah, I mean, if that's not a literal compression of data, I don't know what is. I mean, like and something else I was thinking about too was like when they were trying to argue that it is not comparable. I'm like, you do realize that not that long ago we were using punch cards for data. So
there, man, that would have been you would have been
You're still talking about the compression of the physical medium, which is containing the data.
Correct.
And so there's no way around this. And
Well, and that's what I was trying, and I think I failed. And again, you're making a more brilliant, retort to all this. Is that I kept trying to repeat. It's this technology. Technology is not one thing. It's not just one substrate and one mathematical thing. It's all the above. And technology is always evolving, quote unquote. Not evolutionary wise, but we're trying to take things that otherwise are not possible or are presumed not to be possible. Then we figure out how to make it probable, and then we actually make it happen. We actually turn it and make it a product. That requires a lot of effort, and if we limit to ourselves like they were trying to basically do to just how things are now, we'll never have an advance in technology.
Well, of course not. And what I don't understand on their argument is, and why this disconnect seems to be so strong, other than just being in a state of denial, either ignorance and or denial. As I'm sure you're aware, Microsoft is literally funding the Cambridge genetics department, specifically in the context, a variety of things, but one of the things that they are funding the most is the creation of data storage inside of DNA. Like, this is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. This is being done. It hasn't been done, and they have created their own syntax, created their own storage mechanism. They have GE's invested a bunch of money in it. IBM's invested a bunch of money in it. I would be stunned if Google hasn't invested a bunch of money into it. They've already built this stuff. It's already been done. Like, they've already created their own syntax. They're already storing data. This is already being executed. And there was actually an announcement from, I think it was University of Texas, that they had figured out a new way to account for data loss. And rather than having to have multiple copies, they figured out a way to reduce the data loss through transcript, replication. And what the heck to tell you people? This is not being considered analogous. It's being considered literal by Microsoft, IBM, GE, Google. They all consider this to be literal. And why are we even having to argue about this anymore?
Yeah. Excellent, man. Hope they hear this part. Untangelo, or even John, did you just hear my mic distort?
No, I didn't hear anything.
You did though, Untangelo?
Yeah, I think it was the window which made the whole distortion here. Let me check if it does it again. I wanted to show you this guy. Now it stopped. Okay. What does the compaction in the coiling in DNA? It is this molecule here, condensin.
Mm-hmm.
You see, it literally it grasps on the DNA strand and permits that coiling here.
All right, the histone stuff. Yeah.
So it is a molecule which has the specific purpose to make the compaction possible.
Right, and I guess what the argument that they're wanting to have was that a physical volume, as one guy said, compression is not compatible with trying to do it through human technology when it is.
Well, the thing is that I think we can ask the letters. What is the minimal compaction of the letters of the individual letters which permits the information storage? And I think something smaller than nucleotides is basically impossible. That is something on the atomic scale.
Oh yeah.
So, and what we see here, this is absolutely demonstration of purposeful design, because what would natural selection, why would natural selection come up with that kind of molecule which has the specific function to coil the DNA strand?
Right. What reason, what purpose does it have?
Yes.
This is technology.
Exactly. And you see that in order for the condensin to grasp on the nucleotide strand, it uses ATP. This is like kind of a fork which opens and closes when it's like a hand grasping at the DNA strand.
Okay.
And you have the hinge here which opens and closes in order to permit the coiling. So this is as you said, this is mechanics, this is technology, and to say that this occurred or evolved, that's just nonsense.
Have you guys looked at MEM technology, micro machines?
Some, yes.
Yeah, there are literal, what do you call it, hands like that. There are claws, there are gears, there are valves, there are motors that are in the nanometer thing. That's what we're doing, and that's what I was doing back at TI. There are things like that, like you just showed in Techno, that we're doing artificially through nanotechnology. So since we can do that, we've been doing it now for at least 20 years. That's the whole new paradigm. How can we start mimicking what we see how life does it, and then create our own nanobots type stuff?
Well, and the point you're making, to me, this is where the argument goes beyond incredulity. And by this I mean, I doubt there is a single synthetic chemist on this planet that would ever argue, or even give somebody the time of day, who argued that whatever a nanomachine that you're referring to here, those molecules could ever be structured without dramatic intelligence and like processes that must be followed to the T. Like there can be no variable, otherwise this breaks down. And if anybody ever came to them and said, "Oh, your machine's kind of cool, but that's not that impressive," like I would wager they would probably get punched in the face. Maybe not literally, but I mean, a figurative, like, "Are you kidding me?" And what's going on here? Am I getting knocked out of the...
Having fun throwing us around, I think, from channel.
But I mean, that's why in the context of like the protein nanomachines, it's like if they are exponentially more complicated and have higher functionality than the best things that humans are able to come up with, even though from a molecular perspective, it's the exact same types of processes that are having to be executed. I don't understand how you haven't completely jumped any and all reason at this point.
Well, yeah, it's even worse than that in my mind, because having done that kind of stuff, there is a lot of trial and error involved. We have to use quantum physics for our own human nanotechnology, for the MEMS and stuff like that. And so there's all kinds of just terrible amount of math, terrible amount of just effort to try to not only direct the, for example, the plasma wet and dry etch, the streams of material that we use to try to, as dopants, to try to adhere this stuff to our substrate. You can either, quantum physics, you can only be precise about either the time something is going to be in a quantum scale, or the location, and you can't do both. So the more precise you are where it's going to land, the less precise of when it's going to land, and so, or what how deep it's going to be. And so we're constantly having to battle these what do you call it, these contradicting concepts, essentially. And there's all kinds of just crazy things we try to use to cheat, and trying to combine relativity versus the quantum type stuff. And it's mind-boggling. And even with the most brilliant of the people I've ever worked with on the planet, trying to do this stuff, it's almost pure trial and error. But even trial and error, that's not evolution. That is intelligence trying to figure out and collecting a pool of things that either pass or fail, and purposely selecting intelligently what passed, and then purposely rejecting what failed. I don't think that evolution can do that, even though they claim it does. You know what I mean?
Well, they don't. And I mean, why do you think they're coming up with like extended evolution? Extended EES, extended evolutionary synthesis, and all that stuff? Is because they're not being able to account for the trial and error that's required to get to the new function without death. Like there's no way around it. Like, oh, cool, yeah, we could go from A to B, but you would die in the meantime.
Right. How do you have a nucleotide chain without a mitochondria, right?
Well, and that's what always gets me in the context of some of their supposed genetic evolutionary algorithms.
Mhm.
I'm like, congratulations. You just figured out which lines of code have to be written to get this contact form
Right.
to go from being a simple contact form with name, first name, last name, phone number, and email address to all of that, plus your resume, plus file upload, plus all these other things. Like, awesome. Yes, we could write an algorithm that says, hey, we have to add all of this stuff in here in order to get this new function. Like, congratulations, guys. Like, I mean, anybody could come up with an algorithm to do that. When I say anybody, I mean, it would be, I'm not saying you would have to come up with you do some math and like actually create the formulas and such, but I mean, like, you could come up with that hypothetical. Like, that's a totally doable thing.
Right.
But whether or not it's a remotely plausible one to happen without the intelligent agent, I mean, I don't think anybody would ever make that argument with a straight face. Like the example I just gave, like, nobody would ever go and make that argument.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I'm trying to think of some sort of comparisons with all of this, and I'm thinking that if we were to try to assume, natural evolutionary type processes that they talk about with the technologies that we develop, that trial and error phase, we could joke, yeah, this won't happen in a million or billion years, right, et cetera, et cetera. But even I had this better in my mind, and I'm starting to lose it. I apologize, but even I don't know. It all has a purpose. If we allowed the things that we actually are doing in science right now to be completely random and didn't have that intelligent, cognizant, decision making capability of filtering out the good and the bad results, and just let it to random processes, then we would never develop anything in any of our lifetimes. Certainly. So I understand that they have a lot of faith in the whole thing about deep time and whatnot, but I think that's a pure fairy tale. Because you have to have decisions, you have to have direction, you have to have purpose, you have to have all of these things that help direct which way the different outcomes go to be able to get to any kind of actual functional outcome.
I had recently a guy that was claiming, oh, you don't know how we are developing evolutionary algorithms which we are using to create stuff. And then I answered, show me of 1,000 engineering departments of big companies, how many do use these evolutionary algorithms to develop their products?
Yeah, no, we don't. We use the exact opposite. Yeah, I could equate that. I think I mentioned it recently with one of you guys about how, how does a Falcon 9 evolve into a Falcon Heavy? They've got similar components and similar designs, but they're completely different rocket systems. Someone says something about, well, if they could do it if they were self-replicating. Well, if we would love to have a self-replicating. In fact, I didn't get to finish that point. So Elon right now, most of the newest work and all the new hires are going down to this place called Boca Chica in Texas, in South Texas right now for he's got a new starport facility down there. His goal right now, they're testing the new Starship designs. I don't know how big y'all are into space science stuff, but his goal right now is try to build a Starship prototype he wants to build one a week by the end of this year, which everybody's like, so yeah, that's going to be impossible. They got 5 so far for this year, but so that would be a lovely concept of self-replicate rockets to be able to meet a goal like that. And even if we did that, that's still a Falcon 9 is still not going to self-replicate into a Falcon Heavy. It's just not on its own. Never. Not in a trillion, billion, quadrillion years.
Well, and that's the irony of the argument, right? Of when you place it on the macro level, it's instantaneously considered insane. And the irony is that, if anything, it's more complicated to be occurring on the micro. That's the part that gets me when you really think about the intricacy component of, like, from our perspective, it's easier to weld 2 pieces of steel together than to cause a bond. I'm not saying it actually is easier. I'm just saying, like, from our macro perspective, like, oh yeah, putting 2 pieces of metal together, okay, that's cool. Yeah, I can see that happening. But we wouldn't actually think it would happen, right? Like, okay, this isn't actually a logical conclusion. Therefore, that's a nuts argument. But then it's like, oh well, it's just 2 molecules bonding. Yeah, okay. Like, this is not quite as easy as you think it is here, folks. It's still got to be controlled, and it's got to be specific, and this location and this spot at this time, at this temperature, and all these additional variables have to be in play. And you guys are just trying to toss all of this out the window and be like, oh, it just happened.
All right. Yeah, I can't. I'm having a hard time trying to think of a good analogy for that. Even it's just dumb. Stuff doesn't happen by its own. Certainly not complex stuff. Certainly not universal stuff. That's what convinces me. It's not that life is complex; it's that it's universal.
One of the analogies I've used in the context of some of this, basic. And the irony is, this is like some of the most basic stuff, like a protein sequence, right? It's like, okay, cool. So it's 1,000 codons in length. Let's put this in context of the lottery. You have to pick 1,000 numbers, not just randomly. Like, not just, you don't have to pick them. You have to pick 1,000 numbers in the correct order.
Right.
And if you don't get them all correct, you have to start over every time. Like, you have to get them all correctly on the first guess, right? I mean, if that was the standard for the lottery, if somebody won that, you would immediately be like, how did they cheat?
Right.
Immediately. Like, they rigged the system, they BS. Like, there's no way, right? So for a minimally viable cell, let's say so you had to pick 500,000 numbers in a row, like for all the minimal number of gene sequences and stuff. You had to pick 500,000 in a row. If it's nuts to think that somebody could do this with 1,000, how is it any less implausible if you had to get 500,000? Like, I don't care how many. Like, are you getting out of town, man? This is you've jumped all levels of reason and tossed it out the window. And sidebar, Otangelo, you might find this interesting. So how Pudding tries to claim that the papers you and I mentioned about from Eugene Koonin aren't relevant.
Yes.
Have you actually seen what Eugene Koonin's own improbability calculation was?
I don't remember the number. I think he just brought up of one protein.
Well, no, okay, so his improbability is 1 in 10 to the 1,018th power.
That's nothing. Do that every day.
That's his, right? So he concedes. Well, yes, it's completely implausible. Therefore, we must live in a multiverse. Therefore, it is possible. I was like, oh man, that's too good.
Well, I appreciate Koonin because while he is an atheist, he is honest enough to point out the problems.
That's cool. By the way, guys, today he told me that anybody that calls him Pudding, he will kick from his channel. Just so you know. He does not like that.
Well, when he stops calling me Beta Wolf and Maddox and constantly says I'm full of BS and does ongoing streams about me personally while he's saying I'm full of shit, I might stop calling him Pudding.
I'm worried that I'll be his next rotating target, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, the best analogy I got so far was, again, AI programming is very difficult. Even if you get a stable AI, it likes to break. And it's very complex. It requires full stack. It has a back-end apparatus with a front-end user interface to it. It requires massive databases, all these heuristic layers. Very complex crap. So probably the hardest kind of coding you could do. And to say that,
what it is just chance and time.
Well, so I'm saying, to say you can make an AI by literally just rubbing your face across a keyboard without a keyboard, that's what evolution is. Evolution is writing an AI by just randomly running your hands or your face across a keyboard without using a keyboard.
That's actually a really good thought process. I mean, to me, I just, the other night you and I were talking about, like, what do I know how to code and stuff, and it's like the majority of my skills now are like I can modify a lot of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And that's why it always cracks me up in the context of the evolutionary arguments of like, oh, it was just modifications to a duplicate, and I'm like, okay, I know a lot about that personally because like I have my knowledge of some different languages. Like some of them I can write core functions. Other ones it's I know enough of it to go and modify something. I can make some changes to get my end outcome that I want specifically, specify it, but I never would even dream of writing all the original source code, right? And it's like for people that don't comprehend like the level of difference between what I just described and actually writing the whole thing from scratch, and then going a layer beyond that and having been the one that came up with the framework that's being used. And you keep going down those rabbit holes and then you get to who came up with the language originally.
Yep.
It's being used. And you think about all these different structures that are being applied. And to me, evolutionary biology is arguing about the little surface level mods, like what I was describing of something I might do, right? Like, oh, cool, I'm building a WordPress site. Let's go modify this plugin to make it, customized. And we're going to make, change the CSS so it fits the overall theme layout.
Pre-made libraries, right? Like the imports.
Right. Oh, cool. I went to GitHub and like downloaded a script and like made some mods and be like, oh, I wrote it from scratch, man. Like, no, like get out of here. You go look at the comments in the source file, and you see who actually wrote the thing. Or like, oh, you're giving credit to all these people if it's open source, that kind of stuff. And I'm like, this to me, and correct me if you think I'm wrong on this, like kind of like string of thought here, but like to me, that's what it feels like we're arguing over, while acting like there was never the original author to get to all this point.
I think it's exactly it. There is an author, and they don't want to talk about it. And I was thinking my analogy was woefully incomplete as well. It's not just a lack of keyboard, but like you were saying, there's an API layer, then there's an HMI layer, human machine interface layer, and then there's an operating system, and then there's the physical substrate and all of the microcircuitry to be able to run all these calculations. All of that also has to exist for evolution, quote unquote. So it's literally trying to write an AI by randomly rubbing your face across a keyboard without a computer.
Now consider following that they asked you about if the histones are also in the bacteria. They were not in the bacteria. So you need to have a transition to go from bacteria without the histones and the compaction of the DNA to eukaryotes which have that technology. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the molecular alchemy, he said that he was an expert in the histone code and all that stuff. Do you remember that?
I do, and yeah, if what I understood he said, bacteria do have a codec.
Yeah, it said that I was not in the chat, Joel, but if I had been, I would have asked him, in order for the system to work, you need the histone code, you need the encoding, you need the language of the encoding, and you need the readers, the writers, and the erasers. These molecules which make all this stuff. Otherwise, you cannot have that information system. So what came first? Came first the histone code. Came first the writers. Came first the readers, or came first the erasers, which erased information and then prepared the tail in order to get new information. Which of those came first?
All right. So can you help clarify? So are there histones, or is it something different in bacteria?
The histones, no, the histones, they are not in bacteria. Bacteria doesn't need to compact the compaction rate which we see in eukaryotes. Now, in order for to organize the expression of the genes, the histone tail, it has a code which is read by molecules, and then upon that reading, they can take actions. They can either loosen the DNA strand surrounded at the histones, or they can tighten it. When it's tightened, then the RNA polymerase cannot read the information because it's too tight. Now, when it has to be read, then they loosen the DNA on the histone, and then the RNA polymerase can go and read and express the information. Now, this is orchestrated by extremely complex processes, but the histone code is part of it. So the point is that you need obviously the code, the language, and you need the readers, the writers, and the erasers all at the same time. How do you
Okay.
explain that by evolution?
No.
Well, and I understand how that basically works. You know, in the translocations is what I think that's called in the regular histone type DNA stuff and in the multi-cell stuff. But does that happen also in bacteria? Is there translocation process as well?
No, so
Well,
in the bacteria, it does supercoiling. So
How's that different than the histone coil?
Well, in the eukaryote, the histone itself is like being used to control basically what's being wrapped around and controlling some of that. It's basically the equivalent, just for raw analogy perspective. It's like the bacterial genome is like 2 megabytes, right? You don't really have to compress it. It's basically
in the bacteria though.
there is some it's very mild, very, very mild.
Well, if there's any coiling, then that means that there's a compression going on still.
No, so I'm not saying there isn't a compression. I'm just saying that
was the question. Yeah,
there's still it's just dramatically minimized compared to a eukaryote, and they weren't getting that. You were making that point, and they weren't understanding like there's different types of compression.
Well, thank you, because from what he was explaining to me, it sounded like there's still compression going on, not necessarily exactly the same as the histone, but there's still the technology was still there, just a different form of it. I guess it's Apple versus
can you explain
Android.
That? How is the compression done in how do we compress the information to have that?
So let me read this real quick, Artangelo. So this is from Nature.com. So DNA supercoiling. Whereas eukaryotes wrap their DNA around proteins called histones to help package the DNA into smaller spaces. Most prokaryotes, it's interesting, most prokaryotes do not have histones, with the exceptions of those species in the domain Archaea. Thus, one way prokaryotes compress their DNA into smaller spaces is through supercoiling. Imagine twisting a rubber band so that it forms tiny coils. Now twist it even further so that the original coils fold over one another and form a condensed ball. When this type of twisting happens to a bacterial genome, it is known as supercoiling. Genomes can be negatively supercoiled, meaning that the DNA is twisted in the opposite direction of the double helix, or positively supercoiled, meaning that the DNA is twisted in the same direction as a double helix. Most bacterial genomes are negatively supercoiled during normal growth. And interesting. So it looks like the prokaryotes heavily use I actually mentioned that eukaryotes have it as well, but I was mentioning this the other night. The topoisomerase proteins are heavily involved in this for prokaryote genomes.
Yeah, they disentangle it.
So directly answer your question, yes, there is data compression that's happening in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. The method, the codex that's being used is just different. Is basically what it boils down to.
Sorry, guys. Something funny happened to my wife's game over there. She's still laughing. It's contagious. All right. So there's still a codec involved. There's still compression, decompression, but just
Now, how do we compress the information? That 20% that you said, Joel.
There's just I don't know how many thousands of ways they've changed over the years too. Today, it's mostly just through math, through algorithms. Okay. So I guess a simplified example.
So is it not a physical compression of the medium?
Yeah, not for computer compression, but there's other forms of compression that are.
Of course, you can eventually compress the language in order to require less numbers of signs to have the same information stored, but that's not what we see in life, where the compression occurs physically through the supercoiling.
Well,
but the language is the same. The nucleotide is the same. The genetic code is the same, but the compression occurs through the physical space which is compacted. But my question is, how is it done by us?
Stand by. You okay? Okay. So yeah, no, the higher whatever concept is that however DNA does it, which is, as we pointed out the other night together, thousands of times better than how we're doing it, we suck. However our technology is right now, that's what it is. It's codec technology, compression, decompression. Our codec technology is infantile. It's pathetic compared to how God does it. So we need, however God does it, we need to try to learn for our stuff. So if that means stop using ones and zeros and this crappy mathematical algorithms that we use today, and instead start to physically store our ones and zeros and twos and fours or whatever other information substrate we're going to use, and start to physically coil them like they do in DNA, that's what we need to do, because that's better. That's how technology works. You never limit yourself to one paradigm.
If we could do it on an atomic scale, that would revolutionize.
Yes.
What I hear is that graphene seems to be the next thing.
Say it again.
Graphene, that is carbon sheets, seem to be
graphene. Yeah,
graphene. Yes.
Yeah, that stuff is actually mind bending. The back when I was messing around in the startup space, one of the investment groups that I worked with, they actually invested in over at Oak Ridge. They actually invested in a group that they had figured out a new process to produce graphene at room temperature, and even be able to, they even figured out how to put it into paint. Some of the crazy stuff. But basically they took the cost to create a square meter from like 40 grand down to less than $100. And wow. It's like a massive paradigm shift. And basically where the logic goes, assuming this actually makes it to market, I imagine it will, is, you theoretically you could paint. This is where the whole paint aspect became very interesting. Theoretically, with being able to take it in the liquid form, apply it as paint to any surface type, you now would take whatever that underlying component was, and it would be as strong as steel.
The carbon, yeah.
So to me, when you think about that, of the potential paradigm shifts, when you think about flight technology, all the transport drones and stuff we're trying to build right now, and being implemented and tested in these different countries, what if you could now have something that basically is light as equivalency, right? Light as a feather, but could be used for flight and for personal drones and stuff. That was pretty interesting. But yeah, that technology is going to will be game changers, I think, when it makes it to mass market.
The same with the buckyball thing. Even though that's old now, we're hoping to create new super tensile stuff with that still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my brother-in-law is he's a PhD inorganic chemist, and he actually got sent to. It was pretty interesting. He called me. He worked for a big chemical company, and they actually were considering investing in this venture as well in Oak Ridge, and he got sent to go verify their process and everything. It was pretty interesting talking to him about what they had come up with and the way they figured out ways to solve some of the previously so this is really cool stuff, but it'll never be able to actually be applied in the real world because it's so complicated to so cost prohibitive. They was telling me some of the things they'd figured out to modify it, and I was like, man, it's amazing to think about a level of, oh yeah, it's the strongest possible thing, but we can't do it in the real world. To suddenly, oh wait, we could, and basically could apply it to just about any surface. That's pretty awesome. Talk about a game changer.
That's science, yeah. If I'd stayed in chemistry, I probably would have been going along a similar line like that. It's really cool. Yeah, Tommy, he's commenting in text. The question was how could we adapt DNA codec technology into human compression, decompression, or codec technology? They wanted, the people I was talking with earlier today, they didn't want to entertain the idea of how to do it, or that it couldn't be done.
Right, and Tommy's also pointing out, making. I'm not sure if Tommy's a guy or a girl. Tommy, is making the point about the epigenetic markers that molecular alchemy was talking about, and that's the part that I don't understand why some people working in this professionally don't seem to grasp this component. It's like, yes, we have compression and decompression, or was it condense and what was, I forget the term they used.
Oh yeah,
But compression,
condensation or something silly. Yeah.
yeah. I'm gonna go with compress and decompress because more people understand that.
Yeah.
But then not only that, you have additional data variables that can, or instructional variables that can be added and removed on the fly based on external variables.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, and then you have to factor in the literal, not figurative, not analogous, but the literal read-write and erase proteins that come in and in a controlled manner do the methylation and demethylation.
Yeah, that's what Untangled was just pointing out. Yeah.
I mean, those,
Voice.
I've read a pretty fascinating paper on those, like read, write, and erase proteins. And the way they're describing it, it's like, even in the papers, they talk about how this is like directly comparable to what we're doing in like a baseline technology. And this leads me to something I find relatively entertaining at this point. When you actually can think about the arguments that are being made and the dismissals that are made by the evolutionists about the comparison of like technologies, like you're arguing that the comparison only applies to the hardware, not to the data. So this is like arguing that how the logic gates created themselves, not, or new ones came into existence, not the data that's being expressed through them.
Or the data or the hardware or the hardware, right?
Right. I agree. I mean, but they're trying to like completely dismiss, like, oh, we're understanding the hardware, but dismissing the fact that there's software,
right,
also housed and contained inside of the hardware. And but then arguing that like, oh, well, we're coming up with a way that we can't even explain how the hardware come into existence. And yet we're arguing, and then we're also simultaneously arguing that the software doesn't exist. It's like, what? It blows the mind of, and this is where I go with all that, is like, guys, again, this is like, I made the analogy the other day about the finding the strand of DNA inside of a rock instead of a safe. But the same logic applies to like, you found a server that is apparently 5 billion years old. And then you somehow figured out, you sit there and analyze the hardware, and then you figured out how to interpret the data that was stored on the hardware. And then you claim that, no, there was not intelligent agents that either A, created the hardware, or B, created the data that's stored on the hardware. Like, nobody would, with a straight face, would ever make that argument.
Well, nobody with experience, I would say. There's people that basically are stuck in academia, that have to learn, and that's something that they also pointed out, certain nomenclatures, certain things, and that's all they can know. If they deviate from that, then they don't get their tenure, they don't get to teach whatever class, versus those that are outside of academia, that whose job and their salary is based on their ability to revolutionize all of that, to get away from what was once, the whatever you call it, the current paradigm, the nomenclatures that exist, right? Like they were getting on to me a little bit about, well, you need to call it these things because people will be confused. No. Those of us that are actually in science are paid to invent what the next thing. We have to stop thinking the old ways. Science is always changing, and that's the difference. It's different mentalities.
Yeah, I think molecular alchemy is. I know he's a researcher. I think he's a little bit more open-minded than a lot of the, many of the other ones. I mean, obviously we have, as we can see from chat, and by the way, Speed, I'm not calling you. Well, actually, he who shall not be named. You also get that reference there, Speed. I used to say that all the time. He who shall not be named is in the chat, dropping insults, saying that we're a primitive race. That's interesting. Come and act like we're not being able to comprehend things from a high enough level, and it's like, no, I do comprehend it from a high enough level, and that's why I think the arguments you're making are completely idiotic. And you can only reach those conclusions if you are consciously refusing to see the obvious, especially, to your point, if you have any of the knowledge. that we're discussing right now, then this is obvious. And that's what I find so ironic about He Shall Not Be Named, is that as a coder, he does have the underlying knowledge to be able to see the obvious,
Right.
and yet still denies it. And
Well,
claims that we're clinging to God of the gaps.
yeah, and I think that's just whether that's a variability of creativity or not. But people like that molecular guy, for example, yeah, he knows a lot of things that I wished I knew. So I have a high value for people like him, and even Speed. Everybody has their own little areas of expertise, and that's how science is really improved, is by teamwork, essentially, by gathering past experiences of things that other people have learned to help combine together to help try to figure things out that nobody's ever thought of before, much less figured out. And so the idea that you have to stay in a established field or an established way of thinking things or established nomenclatures, that's what I call anti-science. That's holding yourself back. That's not being creative. That's wanting to just know a static piece of information and you can lord that over people, I guess, if that's what you need to do. But that doesn't perpetrate science. Science is where you combine all of these old things, try to come up with something that's never even thought possible before, and make it happen.
Honestly, I wonder if some of the barriers to all of this stem directly from, and I don't necessarily mean for, I'd say people, say 50 and up, but for the majority of folks below that age, in like my demographic, for example, there seems to have been such a aggressive push in our education system for telling people what to think versus teaching them how to think and come to their own conclusions. And I used to see this all the time in like when I had my software company. I had about 30 employees, and we got peak, and so not a massive company, but I was interviewing people on a regular basis and having new hires and hired people out of college and people experience and all that kind of stuff. And one of the points that we made was starting, especially for the kids coming out of college, was to use Google to try and find answers to your problem before you ask somebody for the solution. And I don't know if you ever messed around with the let me Google that for you tool, but it's hilarious. And if somebody send you an IM chat, and I would oftentimes respond with a let me Google that for you link. And I'll never forget this one girl that I heard, she just out of college, and she sent me a question. And as I was literally about to hit enter with the let me Google that for you link, she runs into my office. She's like, I'm sorry. I shouldn't ask the question. I'm Googling it right now. I'm going to find the answer. I'm sorry. And then lo and behold, and then I remember one of them, probably 6 months in, actually came and talked to me. Back when I was smoking cigarettes all the time. And I was standing in the alley outside of our building smoking a cigarette, and he came out and he's like, man, thank you for always basically telling me not to be an idiot and go look for myself. And he's like, it makes it so much easier now I think that way first to go find an answer and look and see if somebody else had an idea. It might not be the whole solution to my problem, but it put my brain on the right path to like, oh, well, that makes sense. I wonder if I add this and this and this to it, then I can find the solution, or I customize it to my solution, to what I actually need. Yeah. And I know I imagine for somebody like you, that's an intuitive thought, right? But it's what you're describing in terms of the teamwork and taking the different specialties and combining them to be stronger than the sum of our parts, right? And that concept seems to be becoming dramatically minimized as being the optimal versus the outlier. And I think that's a major problem that faces society in general, not just science and whatnot that we're talking about, but I think it's a societal problem that's growing rapidly.
And I agree. I don't know it's specifically anything new though, because the whole time you're talking about that, I was instantly thinking about Einstein's complaint. One of my favorite quotes of his was that education is what one remembers after one has forgotten everything they learned in school. Mm-hmm. And then Friedrich Bastiat, one of my wife and I's favorite political historical figures.
An economist.
Yes, he was a French revolutionary parliamentary member. He was an economist. And he has a whole treatise on how education systems and bachelor degree programs, how, like you were just saying, these things are just, it's enforcing, bad, whatever you call it, old information. You're learning old stuff, and it's hindering progress. So there's all kinds of examples with that, and then even Elon Musk. I love quoting him. He was interviewed recently in Business Week, saying how college is not for learning. He says, it's for fun. You can learn anything for free today, and exceptional ability. It has nothing to do with education and things like that. And there's all kinds of Google itself. The Google, the execs that started Google dropped out of college. They never finished their masters, and yet here they are. Same with Apple guys. So
Zuckerberg.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, yeah. So you have to show, yeah. And I don't know. I agree with you that it is a mentality. There's a lot of people that just they want to do the bare minimum, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's a personality thing. People just want to go to work. They want to push a button and go home, drink beer, and go fish, whatever. Play video games. I like playing video games. And then other people, they like to stretch themselves. They like to say, okay, hey, how do we? NASA sucks. How do we get to Mars? Go to Russia. Okay, Russia sucks even worse. So what do we do? Let's build our own rocket. Everybody that tries always fails. Okay, well, if we fail, we fail. And now here we are. Now we've got a interplanetary class self-landing over. We got this Falcon Heavy now. We're working on the Starship. That's just because somebody said they didn't want to just listen, and then they figured it out. And that also reminds me, even, as another good example of this, when Elon was first starting his company. I don't know if you guys ever read his history and stuff like that. Some of the first, because he was just a physicist. He had nothing to do with rocket science. He'd hire these rocket engineers from these other, the Rocketdyne, all the other companies, and he'd ask them all these seemingly basic, rocket questions, engineering questions. And some of these guys wrote afterwards how they were offended. They were like, "Who's this guy? You guys are a rich snob out of Silicon Valley, questioning me about my knowledge of these things." And Elon was like, "No, he's not questioning their knowledge. He's wanting to learn from them. He's asking them these questions so he can know."
Yeah.
And that's how he built that company. And
That point you're making about the curiosity and wanting to know for yourself.
Yeah.
And you were talking about this too in context. You were talking about with Speed and all those guys earlier. You were talking about the same point of like the premise of wanting to learn other stuff. It's I don't understand why people view that as some kind of a like barrier. Like in my context, with my software company, right? Like doing all the biz dev, I had to learn a ridiculous number of different business models on the fly, and then be able to leverage my knowledge, what was possible in technology, and price point, and all resources and all that kind of stuff, and be able to come up with a solution or help them come up with a solution, right? In terms of like the top level schematics and such. The point I'm making is that I had to learn all these different business models and service lines, all these different things, and then how are we going to apply this to improve those businesses? Not just, hey, here's a short solution. Like, how are we going to look at the here and now and the future, right? And just use that as an example. But I found that extraordinarily fascinating and interesting to like go out, learn all this other stuff, and then like keep up with the latest and greatest, like newest availability stuff and scripts and different APIs and all this kind of stuff, right? I found that very interesting. Now I find it very interesting to go and be learning stuff about genetics and new biochemistry discoveries and functions and applications, all those kinds of stuff. I find that extraordinarily fascinating.
Yeah,
you're
an innovator. Yeah,
but when I listen to the supposed experts, seem to be completely incapable or unwilling to learn about, to even comprehend or even consider the cross-pollinated application of what we're talking about, right? And you were discussing this earlier of like, it's technology. Like, do you not get this? Like, there's it's the same type of premise is what I felt like was going on is going on now in academia.
Yeah, and I think I've talked about it once or twice recently, talking with all you wonderful guys, how I did life backwards. I got experience and I got hired based on that experience, and then I'd go to school, just to increase my salary. And it was frustrating because as somebody with the experience and the actual knowledge, in the field, and then having to go learn the stuff that they're trying to teach in school was it was heartbreaking. It was disheartening. I was like, what the heck am I paying this money for? This is old stuff. The latest and greatest that they were teaching in class was stuff that was revolutionary before I was born. And I'm like, wait a minute. And so it's like, I think that's a problem. I think there's a bunch of old school, there's a bunch of old guards that are trying to, and you see that, you even see that in programmers. I don't know if Speed's still in here or not. Programmers, they tend to go one of two ways, basically, where, they get into the industry and they learn a language, and they want to hyper focus on just that language. You want to become the best Fortran guy or the best Pascal guy or the best whatever coder. But then something happens and that language is no longer as relevant, and people have moved on to something other than whatever it is that they focused on for 10, 20 years. And, when they're in their latter part of their career, they're basically useless, so we're not, I don't know. So
when you're talking about that, I agree with you 100%. I actually dealt with that quite a bit with like directors of IT, usually not like CTOs, but very often like the folks right below that level that had gotten moved up mostly through seniority rather than actual skill. Right. But I ran into that a lot when we like making recommendations, like, oh, well, you think we should use this platform, this blah, 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 whatever it was. And then very often you get massive pushback from those individuals and pushing for an outdated option or something that wasn't cutting edge. Right.
Something that they felt they were expert of and that they could contribute more.
And I actually had some fun one time in a boardroom where this guy was pushing us to do this very outdated thing. I'm like, no, not going to happen. We've been going back and forth. Anyway, now fast forward to the boardroom to like trying to close the deal. And I made my recommendation. Again, it was against the one he wanted. He started going off on his tangent. I was like, you know what? And I looked over at the CEO and I was like, you know what? Actually, I'm going to withdraw my offer. And I think I'm not the right choice. My company's not the right choice for this. And he kind of looked at me like, what? It was pretty big. It was a pretty big company. I mean, I'll put you that way. And he's looking at me like, because usually a vendor in that same scenario is like, kissing ass and,
right,
rubbing it like, please, can I please have the deal,
Show me the money.
So he's like, excuse me? I was like, I looked right over at the director of IT and I was like, look, what it boils down to is he doesn't understand a word that's coming out of my mouth. And I'm trying to offer you something that's the latest, greatest, the most cutting edge and is actually applicable and has potential scale for your company. You're right. Wanting to hire us to bring, a new application that's, going to be able to have, longevity. Right. And I was like, I'm not going to accept your money and I'm not going to waste my team's time building something that's antiquated before we write one line of code. Like, I'm not doing it. And I was like, so I appreciate the opportunity, but I'm just not going to waste any of our time. And I've got more things to do. So I appreciate your time. And I got up and walked out of the boardroom. And I went back to my office and my partner at the time, he's like, what happened? How'd it go? And I told him what went down. He's looking at me like, you are the most insane person of all time. Like, why did you do that? I'm like, dude, I'm not doing it. Like, just bad business. Anyway, 2 hours later, my phone rings and it's the CEO of the company. And he's like, so, just got to say, like, that was one of the ballsiest things I have ever experienced. I cannot believe what you said. I was like, well, I apologize. I hope I didn't offend you. But, like, that's the way I felt, and that's the way I do business. I'm not going to, like, BS around the deal. And he's like, well, actually, I wanted to say thank you. He's like, you're actually confirmed a suspicion I've had for quite some time. And he's like, well, we'd like to do business with you. And I'm like, I'm telling you, I'm still not. I appreciate your, saying that, but I'm not dealing with him. Like, it'll be a hassle. And he's like, no, tell you what, you will not have to work with him. And I will assign a specific person that directly reports to me to handle this project.
Nice.
And I was like, anyway, long story short, we worked out the terms, did the deal, and ended up moving on. But I use that long-winded story to the point you were making of like, these people don't even know what the heck they're talking about. And they're so behind the times that, and especially in software and technology in general, like, it grows so the possibilities are changing so fast
Yep.
You can't just, you don't want to like do everything that's unstable, right? In terms of the, latest and greatest platforms. But if it's got some, if you're not just like, version 1, you might want to do that. Like I remember this one web app we built. These guys wanted us to make it compatible with IE8.
Deal.
And this was like I think it's like 2 years after Microsoft had stopped supporting it. And they wanted us to write them a web app that was compatible with IE8. And we're like, no. No.
Dude, are you
No.
familiar? You are familiar with Angular, right? I think you mentioned your AngularJS.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a what do you call it? There's a configuration setting for which type of operating system specifically you can allow, and you can't do IE8 and or IE10. You can't do both.
Right.
You can do for almost every other browser package out there known to man, except for those two.
Yeah, it's
go ahead, man.
It's nuts. Okay, hey guys. By the way, I'm doing I just realized it's time. I'm doing an after show for the Mr. Batman and Jim Majors debate. I actually gotta hop over to my channel because I gotta launch that sucker in 3 minutes. So if anybody wants to, I don't want to steal folks from your stream, Angelo, but I gotta bounce over to my channel to do that after show.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for stopping by, John, and see you next time.
Awesome. Thanks, Joel. Great talking to you, man.
Bye-bye.
If you don't mind, John, let's throw a link in here. I'll follow later when we're done here.
Okay. Let's see. I'll put it in private chat. All right, there's a link.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll look the. Yeah.
All right, talk to you guys later.
You take care, man.
Bye-bye.
And I was going to say anything. I'd love to still talk about whatever you want to talk about tonight.
Yeah, I actually want to stop a little bit earlier than last night, Joel, because it is almost midnight here.
And
in
the future.
So I think we could make a review about your chat today at Speed's channel tomorrow night, if that is okay for you.
I guess so. We kind of seem to do most of it already, and I'm trying to think of the diplomatic way of saying I really don't care about their.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, you are welcome to come to my channel and talk about anything else too. And we can also raise other topics which certainly are relevant to our faith and our testimony, and grow each other.
Oh yeah. No, and if you wanted to critique whatever happened there, then I'm fine with that too. I guess it seemed. I can't think of a nice way of saying it, so I'm not going to say it.
Now
you have to say it because you got everyone curious.
But I mean, I don't know. I don't mind asking or answering questions. How's that?
Okay. Let's do following. Let's just elucidate that offline. I will end the broadcast, and then we'll chat a few minutes before I finish here for tonight. Okay?
Sure.
Okay. So everyone, good night. Thank you very much for being at my channel and assisting. Till next time. Bye-bye.